Hi, we're moving on with sexuality. I never thought that the topic was so deep and vast. It's as if I dived into the Pacific and realized that beneath me was the Mariana Trench. The topic is extremely vast, because what we're talking about determines not only our sexual communication, which must continue for a certain number of minutes, it determines our lifestyles, our ambitions, aggressions, relations, the way we look at one another, at work, at home, on the street, on the bus, everywhere. Sexuality is to a major extent a brain game, but the brain does so many things thanks to it, and at the same time, sexuality impacts it too. This is a game played both ways. You have often heard the saying, "It's all hormones." I suppose many of you will say that for men we speak about testosterone, and for women estrogens and progesterone. In the previous part of the MEDcast, I forgot to say that the parts that determine the sexual pleasure in men and women have receptors for both estrogen and progesterone in women and for testosterone in men. So they are not only implicated, but are influenced and modulated by these hormones. So, are testosterone and estrogen our main sex hormones that make us desire sex and everything? I will convince you that it is not true. They are very important participants in it, and without them we would not be able to experience sexual desires or have good sex, but in no way are they decisive for it. As a matter of fact, the main hormone in both sexes is the brain pleasure hormone called dopamine. Dopamine determines the pleasure of the brain. So, it is the reward for the brain for the job well done. But what actually happens? When you want to have sex, or when you are playing some game and expect to win, be it in gambling even, dopamine spikes. Is the peak when you win? No, dear friends. It rises sharply just before winning, before receiving the award. Dopamine surges when you are anticipating the award, while you are expecting sex, waiting to win, and not when you win. And what is even more interesting about the brain? An experiment was made. A monkey sits with a button in front. When a light comes on, it has to press a button, and it receives, say, a candy bar. The monkey's dopamine levels are checked, and they notice that even before having pressed the button, the dopamine is already high, so it expects to press the button and get the reward. The experiment continued. They decided to play some games with the monkey. It would not get a reward after every time it pressed the button, so it doesn't receive a candy bar, but the light still comes on. They see whether it will press the button and how dopamine changes. If it receives a reward, in 25% of cases, dopamine rises higher than the levels if it were to receive an award every time. But if it gets rewarded in 50% of cases, dopamine reaches levels it could never achieve in other cases. This is the so-called formula of anticipation. This 50% of reward anticipation is widely used in gambling, in giving out rewards. But what I'm sharing is first to introduce you to the great hormone that dopamine is, and second, to incline you to certain thoughts about sexual communication. Sexual communication and sex are strongest when you are anticipating it, and when its odds are at 50%. Anticipation raises dopamine the most in both sexes. It acts on the neurons in the brain. Furthermore, these neurons receive 3 types of hormones. There are 5 dopamine receptors, but D1, D2, and D5 are the main ones that determine sexual communication. It turns out that in mammals, if women do not have the D5 hormone, they cannot experience sexual pleasure. I can speak at length, maybe dedicate a whole MEDcast to D1 and D2, but let me tell you that in animals it is seen that for animals that form permanent couples after becoming attracted to one another, D1 should sharply rise with a sharp drop in D2. Experiments show that if one of these does not happen, that is, if D1 receptors don't multiply and if D2 ones do not disappear, if D1 doesn't increase or D2 doesn't drop at all, these couples form, they have sexual communication, but they separate instantly, in minutes, if we're talking about mice or rodents, which should otherwise form long-term couples. You might instantly ask, so what is the situation in people? Let me tell you. In families, in long-term couples, there is a higher expression of D2 and D1. But there is also a counter-study. People with high D2 and D1 receptors have, in general, long-term relationships. But here comes the role of the prefrontal cortex that will be mentioned later on. And these monogamous couples, in 90% of cases, in developed countries, usually have marriages that last 4 to 5 years. Huh? Why? Because this is usually the period in which they care for children. After that, they do not start changing partners, but begin new monogamous relationships that last another 4 to 5 years. So here, we are not speaking about changing a partner or adultery. We speak of monogamy that lasts some 4 to 5 years, thanks only to brain receptors. I needed to tell you that and hope you will remember it later on when we speak about cheating, its meaning and what it represents. In order for dopamine to separate from these structures, it needs another hormone in the brain that we also call a neurotransmitter to make this dopamine secrete. Here comes the difference between the two sexes. In one case, in women, this would be oxytocin that is secreted by the brain, and in men, vasopressin. Hold on a sec, you might say. Wasn't that in childbirth? In contractions? Yes. But the brain uses it very smartly. Oxytocin is much more important to the brain than for the uterus or the reproductive system. Oxytocin is the hormone that we say forms fondness, forms a couple. In women, oxytocin is the hormone that makes the mother and her baby close. The moment the baby latches onto the breast, enormous quantities of oxytocin secrete and spill into the brain, because this is the empathy between the mother and her newborn. Similarly, in sexual communication, when forming a couple, huge quantities of oxytocin spill onto the neurons, get caught on the receptors and secrete dopamine, and it respectively starts affecting pleasure in the woman's brain. The same goes for vasopressin in men. In men, the hormone of sexual closeness and desire is vasopressin. It is what makes a man work towards getting closer to a woman. Where does testosterone come in? Some might ask. Testosterone does not cause sexual desire. It models it. In other words, if you have all the fake testosterone, steroids and everything, thinking that it will make you stronger in bed, nope, you only need some 10% of it to reach this sexual level. It is extremely interesting, because testosterone is only a factor that unlocks this. Furthermore, testosterone is at its peak after sex. It does not drop, dopamine does. But sex is something else. Furthermore, it is noted that testosterone is at its lowest the moment men become fathers, the moment they touch their baby. That is, when men have the lowest testosterone levels. Estrogen in women is usually peaking during ovulation. That is when a woman's voice becomes higher. It is believed that she also changes her clothing when estrogen peaks. She dresses much more provocatively. And what's more, the brain plays a game again. Because when estrogen peaks, she experiences many changes in behavior, in her voice, in communication. You might wonder why. Because hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are unlocking factors for sexual communication, but not determining it. Why unlocking factors? Because thanks to them and their radiolytic products, we form the so-called pheromones. They are at the core of sexual communication and desire. A lot can be said about pheromones. Pheromones are what makes three girls who share a dorm synchronize their periods. If there is one dominant female with other younglings, pheromones are what help them slow down puberty. Pheromones are what men sense and help them feel whether a woman is ovulating or not. Pheromones are what attract a gay man to another man, and they can instantly recognize one another. Pheromones are widespread in manufacturing perfumes. We sense them with our brains. They make it straight to our smell. It is known that mainly testosterone pheromones are used in perfumes. I was surprised. I wondered why women's perfumes should smell of testicular pheromones that are usually used in male animal species sweat. Now they are synthesized artificially, but previously natural ones were used. As in Chanel No. 5, for example. The sweat of a whipped Abyssinian civet cat was used as a main pheromone. In the 90s even, the company had a big issue with environmental protection organizations and protests against that. Why exactly Abyssinian civet cats, I cannot explain. But still, the perfume has existed for so many years. So why do women's perfumes have androgen pheromones? A purely commercial trick. When girls smell it, and they are the ones buying it, they feel attracted to this perfume more, with the pheromones of a male individual. And merchants use this. And men? In male perfumes, again male pheromones are used because a man chooses his perfume based on whether a kind lady would tell them they smell good. If yes, that's the perfume they need. The pheromone has attracted her attention. Pheromones are the essence of everything. I must say about pheromones in women in menopause, back to this topic, they have no pheromones. This is one of the reasons they are not all that attractive to men if they have no hormones, nor take any hormones. Castrated men also have no pheromones, and are not attractive to women. I make a link here to the MEDcast about hormone therapy and the necessity thereof. It is again related to pheromones. Let's move along. I promised to tell you about cheating. A study was made in the 80s on monogamous birds, European robins. scientists managed to sequence genomes and study them. But it was noted that in these monogamous birds, cheating was actually very widespread, and a lot of individuals actually belonged to parents from other nests. We spoke about the D1 and D2 hormone levels and how monogamous relationships in most of these processes last 4 to 5 years, and why that is. In fact, cheating is again related to leaving as many copies of your genome as possible, firstly, but this is another brain game. In men, this is a game of hunting, because the amygdala awakens, seeking, aiming, and capturing. In women, it is all about anticipation. The anticipation of something happening which releases large doses of dopamine. In order to completely confuse you, I will tell you about the Koolage Syndrome. Calvin Coolidge was no scientist. He was one of the many less-known American presidents. The history is from the Great Depression. I will read the story. The story of President Calvin Coolidge and the chicken farm that every evolutionary psychologist knows by heart. The president and his wife decided to visit a commercial chicken farm in the 1920s, as I mentioned, the Great Depression. During the tour, the First Lady asked the farmer how he managed to have so many good eggs with so few roosters. The farmer readily answered that his roosters would happily oblige and mate dozens of times a day. The First Lady asked, "Perhaps you could tell that to the President?" As he heard the remark, President Coolidge asked the farmer whether each rooster would only work on one and the same hen every time, to which the farmer replied, "Oh no, different hens every time." "I understand," the President said. "Perhaps you could tell that to Mrs. Coolidge." The Koolage Syndrome is precisely that. Upon changing mates, the male always manages to start with a new game generated by his brain, and his sexual desires are restarted. The second topic I mentioned is homosexuality. I told you that LeVay, he's still alive today, already in his 80s, he wrote in the 90s that the hypothalamus nucleus is different in gay men. There are thousands of papers I've been through, mostly about gay couples. There have been limited studies of lesbian couples. I will explain why. For example, there was a study of twins in the US, which showed the percentage of gay monozygotic twins was much higher than that of dizygotic ones. Another interesting, very large study later found that the more older brothers in the family, the greater the chance of being gay. I'd like to bring you all back to the anatomical characteristics. There are different studies that try to determine the index to ring finger ratio, which is different in gay and straight men, which I think is not so significant. Another study I was really curious about is of the so-called phantom penis syndrome. It compares transsexual men to men castrated due to testicular carcinoma. When the penis is removed in heterosexual men, the brain, as it does in any case of amputation, be it arm or leg, makes you feel as if you still have that limb. The same goes for them when the penis is removed. They continue feeling as if they still have it years later, whereas 0% of transsexual men experience this. That is, the brains of transsexual and heterosexual men are different and have extremely different experiences and perceptions. Back to LeVay's study. published in the 90s, where he saw that the hypothalamus nucleus in gay men was the same as in women. It was instantly attacked for being done in men that died from AIDS. One way or another, I believe this is a postulate, and although further research was not conducted and it was broadly disputed, it was strongly embraced by gay communities in the States. I think it was well-founded, and indeed there is a difference in the brains of homo and heterosexual men. Some of you might be asking yourselves whether this is genetic. I can only tell that sexuality is formed throughout the lifetime. The brain experiences sexual emotions even before we start secreting estrogen and testosterone. In our prenatal development, I should dedicate a whole lecture to speak about that. It is not a matter of the mother being subjected to extreme doses of testosterone for the fetus to have a gay brain. Furthermore, the study with the brothers from earlier showed that the brain continues to develop after birth, which shows that the formation of these smaller nuclei in the hypothalamus could happen in a person's 20s. Things are linked, both the prenatal development and in the latter development of the human being, which in no way makes them different to us, or is not normal. Quite the contrary, this is absolutely normal. But from the point of view of reproduction, homosexuality is rather interesting. First, it is widespread in many animal species too. Meanwhile, biology asks the question, if our only goal is to leave as many copies as possible of our genome, then why are there sexual relationships if they are doomed not to spread their genome? Furthermore, if we consider homosexuality as something that will not spread and will not be capable of leaving a genome copy, then why are there at least 20% of homosexual relationships in each generation? There are many theories on this topic, a lot of explanations. I will not bore you with all of them, but the theory that I subscribe to is that the brain is formed under the theory of helpers at the nest. That is, remembering what our ancestors needed, as every brain remembers hundreds of generations back. In caring for the offspring and the household, there is a need for male individuals to help, and the brain forms such persons. Of course, our frontal cortex persists. These people naturally wish to have their own children, but this does not change the theory of helpers at the nest. If this theory is true, it could also explain the difference in fingers, since these people thus become much more dexterous and capable of assisting in different activities, be it fruit picking or gathering. Furthermore, wondering why many spiritual leaders, and leaders in general, refuse to reproduce. Why do they refuse to have children or sex? In my opinion, the explanation is not that the genome has recognized it is so perfect that it could not leave copies and reproduce, that it could worsen over time. I believe that these people's brains experience greater pleasure in the game of speaking to the masses, teaching and training. Perhaps this is the explanation as to why they reject this. Referring back to the gay community, many gay men are unparalleled in art, excellent musicians and extraordinary writers. Perhaps their brains orient towards another kind of link, different to reproduction. For women, as I said, very little has been written. About women, as I said, very little has been written. Only very few studies exist. But I believe that in these cases, it is not the helper at the nest theory, but rather a game of the brain. Of course, this is only my opinion and reflection on the topic, where the brain remembers the thousands of wars in men, the thousands of empty homes where women had to step up and manage on their own to take care of children, farming, hunting, and working in the field. Therefore, these brains have the embedded feeling of, we will make it without men. This is my personal explanation of homosexuality in women. Moving along, before I conclude, I spoke about dopamine, but not of serotonin. The two are frequently mentioned together, but are very different. In one case, the brain speaks of pleasure, what we experience in sex or sexual arousal, while serotonin is responsible for happiness, something very different. A lot of people nowadays confuse pleasure and happiness. Pleasure is lighting my pipe, but happiness is being surrounded by friends or being close to your most loved ones. These are very different. Serotonin is what lowers dopamine levels when it is active. People on serotonin reuptake therapies with high serotonin levels have less sex and do not experience an orgasm precisely because serotonin manages to inhibit the secretion of dopamine. You might wonder whether this means that the two hormones are in a battle. No. It is just that the brain prioritizes one and then the other, happiness and pleasure. But when the brain manages to connect the serotonins, because serotonin is secreted in the mid part of the brain, and dopamine in the limbic system and the frontal cortex, when these two manage to connect so that the dopamine receptors can cause serotonin secretion, that is, when you experience a pleasure that grows into long-term happiness, that, my friends, is love. When the secreted serotonin can cause a desire for that, then these are links built in the brain and considered by it as love and affection. When two people in love communicate, they combine the secretion of serotonin and dopamine. I will tell you about a study on long-term relationships and contacts with dopamine and serotonin. People who have recently lost their partners are shown a picture of their loved one, and dopamine instantly spikes because the brain reacts with it. When the same picture is shown 5 years later, only serotonin levels increased. The dopamine system does not react at all. With this, I think I will wrap up a very lengthy and really interesting topic. If you've managed and had the patience to listen to it all until the end, everybody could discover something about themselves or their sexual experience. Do not forget that everything is in this little pebble. But, above all, never forget that in order to have good sex, good reproduction, just have a good life in general, you need to be happy. The brain needs this happiness. It is its greatest reward. See you soon.